1954.
Yes.
That is to say, 4 months after the Brown versus Board of Education case.
Mm-hmm.
And you were 9 when Martin Luther King made a speech in Washington.
Mm-hmm.
Was that what motivated your interest in the race? No. Was that what motivated your interest in the race relations?
No, but the dates that you mentioned are obviously important dates in my own life, and they are also important dates in the history of race relations in the United States. So 1954 is one of the landmark dates in the history of race relations because, of course, on September 17th, 1954, Brown versus Board of Education was decided. Along with a companion case that people often don't mention, but there was Brown versus Board of Education and Bowling versus Sharp. Those were the two cases that were decided on September 17, 1954. The other date that you mentioned, I guess it was in August 1963. That's right, I was 9 years old. I did not go to that march. My mother was pregnant with my little sister. And my father went to the march, my brother went to the march, but they wanted somebody to be with my mother, and so I had to stay behind. But I remember very clearly the march, and I remember very clearly watching on television as Martin Luther King Jr. gave this great I Have a Dream speech. The thing that made me interested in race relations law, when I went to law school, that was not my major interest, but at my law school, there had been a gentleman who had taught a course on race relations law for a long time, and he had left the law school, and the course had not been taught. And one of the higher ups, one of the authorities, came to me and asked me would I be interested maybe in pursuing this as a course, and I did it, and I liked it, and I've been doing it ever since. So thank you for your question. Others?
Yes. As far as you're concerned, did you personally suffer from discrimination as a child? Did it recently happen to you despite your social status?
Yes. So as your colleague mentioned, I was born in 1954. I'm from Columbia, South Carolina. Columbia, South Carolina is in what is called in the United States the Deep South. South Carolina was one of the Confederate states. It's one of the states that seceded from the United States. In fact, the Civil War began in South Carolina. And my parents were refugees from racial oppression in South Carolina. They left with me when I was quite young. I was 3 or 4 years old. But I used to go back to South Carolina quite often. And I used to spend summers there. And I very vividly remember in 1963 and in 1964, when I would go back to Columbia, South Carolina, the public parks were all closed in South Carolina because courts had ordered that those parks be desegregated. Prior to then, you had certain parks that were set aside for whites, certain parks that were set aside for blacks. And the court's system said you cannot do that anymore. So instead of allowing people to go to whatever park they wanted to go to, the authorities in South Carolina closed all the parks. I remember that very well. I also remember going to movie films in South Carolina. The one that's most vivid in my mind is going to see the movie The Nutty Professor. So I went to see The Nutty Professor with a cousin of mine, and we went to see The Nutty Professor. The big theater, the white people went in the front of the theater, the colored people went in the side of the theater. The white people sat on the first floor. The black people sat in the balcony. But it's a funny thing. I saw all of this through the eyes of a 9-year-old or 8, 9, 10-year-old. And I did not, at that point, experience it as a type of oppression. In fact, I thought it was a benefit being in the balcony because when the lights would go down, the youngsters would throw candy. And so the black youngsters were in a much better position because we were up top and we would throw candy on the people below, and it was much more difficult for the people below to throw candy on us. But, you know, I mean, as I grew older, I did see the ugly side of racial oppression. So, for instance, when my father would drive us to the South, my mother would always pack sandwiches and beverages, sodas, so that we wouldn't have to stop, because if we would have to stop, we would suffer racial oppression, or it was just very uncomfortable. So we would take whatever we were going to eat or what we were going to drink, we would just have to keep in the car with us so that we wouldn't have to interact with white people, frankly. And so growing up, yeah, I saw racial oppression. I saw my father would often be pulled over when we would drive in the Deep South, because the car that my father would have a Washington, D.C. license plate on it. And there would be police officers who would pull us over. He was doing nothing wrong, but they would pull us over. And the officer would say, "I see that you have a Washington, D.C. license plate." And my father would say, "Yes, sir, that's true." And the officer would say, "Well, you know, we do things differently down here. You do know that, right?" And my father would say, "Yes, sir," and the police officer would let us go. But it was, you know, it was very, it created a lot of nervousness, and I was very aware that black people were being oppressed, you know, not only in the Deep South. I mean, you know, it's a mistake to think the racial oppression in the United States was most obvious in the Deep South. They had signs up, you know, colored people go to the bathroom over here, or white people go to the bathroom over here. But throughout the United States, in the North, in the West, all through the United States, there has been racial oppression. Other questions? Yes?
How much do you think people like Abel Miracle and Billie Holiday helped prepare for the civil rights movement? Do you think they contributed more than the NAACP, for example?
No, you mentioned Billie Holiday. Who was the first person that you mentioned?
Yes.
You mentioned it, but before Billie Holiday, who was the other person?
Abel Miracle.
That was more known as Lewis Allen, the person who actually wrote the poem Strange Fruit.
Yes. Well, I mean, the people that you mentioned were important people insofar as, and you know, the song Strange Fruit was an important song memorializing lynching. And that was important. But was it as important as the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP? No. There's no organization in American history, certainly in the 20th century, any of that was more important than the NAACP. So, for instance, you mentioned Brown versus Board of Education. The lawyers that brought that case were lawyers that worked for the NAACP. The NAACP was begun in 1909. It still exists. It's still an important organization, but there's been no organization in American history more important in advancing racial justice than the NAACP. I had the great good fortune of working for the most famous lawyer who worked for the NAACP, the great Thurgood Marshall. And there are other people who work for the NAACP. You mentioned, to get back to your question, you mentioned, was I aware of, when I was growing up, of racial injustice? I have a very clear memory. In 1963, in fact, on June 11th, the evening of June 11th, 1963, there was a very great man in Jackson, Mississippi. His name was Medgar Evers. That night, the evening of June 11th, 1963, Medgar Evers was killed. He was shot to death in front of his home. He was the executive director of the NAACP in Mississippi. He was a young man. He was in his 30s when he was killed, and he had been a veteran. He had fought in World War II for the United States of America, and he was buried in a cemetery in the United States. It's called Arlington National Cemetery. If you're a veteran, you have a right to be buried in Arlington National Cemetery, and that's where he was buried. And his body was transported from Jackson, Mississippi to Washington, D.C. And my parents went to pay their respects. He was at a funeral home in downtown Washington, D.C. And I went with my parents, and the whole way to the funeral home, my parents argued as to whether I should be allowed in the funeral home to actually see Medgar Evers' body. My father wanted me to go into the funeral home. My mother did not. My mother won the argument, so I stayed in the car while they went and paid their respects. But I remember that very clearly, very clearly. There were people throughout the 1960s who suffered a great deal because of their civil rights activism, and I was very aware of that. Others?
Yes. Do you think we focus too much on Martin Luther King and not enough on the Second Marshall?
It's a really good question. It's a really good question. Actually, yes, I think that people, I think Martin Luther King Jr. was a great person. And he has become, not only in the United States, but around the world, the symbolic leader of the civil rights movement. So when people say civil rights movement, they immediately think of Martin Luther King Jr. He was great. But it should be known that he didn't do it alone. There were people who came before him, there were people who came after him, and during his life, there were a number of wonderful civil rights leaders, and people don't know enough about them. So, for instance, I mentioned the importance of the NAACP. Well, there was another group, a fabulous organization, a wonderful organization, deeply important organization, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. This was an organization of college students, mainly college students. And one of the people who helped institute the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was a wonderful woman by the name of Ella Baker. And people don't mention Ella Baker much anymore, but she was a very important figure. One of the reasons why people don't mention Ella Baker, or don't mention Majeska Simpkins, or don't mention Medgar Evers' wife, or don't mention some of the other women who were very important in the civil rights revolution, was because, frankly, sexism. And women were very important in the civil rights revolution. But because women have been marginalized, because women have been oppressed, the women who were so important in the civil rights revolution have not gotten their due. And that's still the case. I mean, in the United States, when people talk about the civil rights revolution, again, everybody talks, Martin Luther King or Thurgood Marshall, and they were great. But there were others, and particularly women, who were, very important. They often were in the background, but in a social movement, it's often the people that are in the background who show up day by day by day, who make things happen. And that was the Black American women in particular. And not just Black American women, and people ought to know that it wasn't just Black people who were important in the civil rights movement of the 1950s and the 1960s. There were white people who struggled right alongside. There were white people who were killed alongside of black people in the struggle for racial justice. Others?
Yeah.
Yes.
You are known for tackling racial issues frankly. Does that mean that speaking about these issues in the USA is a taboo?
Well, it's not taboo, but it is the case that people get used to certain ideas and certain ways of talking about ideas. And I mean, I think I try to see things in a new way. I try to voice ideas, sometimes using, you know, different terminologies, and I try to be very frank in what I think. And sometimes people don't like that. Sometimes people don't like, you know, people get used to a certain sort of terminology or a certain way of seeing things, and don't like, you know, seeing things in a different way. And I do. So I have my say. I'm very fortunate. You all are students, right? Well, I'm a student too. It's just I'm a paid student, and I essentially, I'm a professional student, and I get to view things in a different way. I get to write. I get to test out ideas with people just like you, and I talk and I get reactions from people and think and rethink and play around with ideas, and I do that and I like it, and sometimes others don't like it. Others?
Yes. In your latest book, you explain that for the Democrats, affirmative action is a way to explain a certain guilt for the white community. Does it mean that Republicans don't have any problems with the history of their country?
Ah, that's a good question. And the answer, it's a really good question. The answer to your question is that unfortunately, many Republicans, not all, but many, most, are very complacent about the history of the United States. Many Republicans view the United States as being always right. Many people in the Republican Party in particular view the United States as a country that is always virtuous, always right, always better than every other country. In fact, many Republican critics of the current president of the United States, Barack Obama, are angry at the current president of the United States because they're critical of him. They're angry with him because he does not, in their view, praise the United States enough. There's a term in America called American exceptionalism. And the Republican Party thinks that American exceptionalism is a good thing. What they mean by American exceptionalism, it's the doctrine which says that America is an exceptional country. America is God's country. America is, their perception is that America should lead the world, and that America is the beacon for liberty and freedom and justice and can do nothing wrong. I think that that's profoundly mistaken. I think that the United States of America has done many good things. I think that it has contributed many good things to the world. On the other hand, the United States, the history of the United States is a history that is soaked in all sorts of injustices. You ask the question, the United States is a huge country, right? And look on a map, it's huge, huge country. Well, where did that land come from? Was it just found? Was it empty? Of course not. It was taken from the Native American. Slavery, important part of American history. The United States is a country that is a very violent history, an extraordinarily violent history. You asked the question, it's a classic question in American life. Why is there no socialist party in the United States? There is virtually no socialist. There is a teeny tiny socialist. Why is there no socialism? Why is there no workers' movement? Why is there no militant workers' movement in the United States? Well, because workers' movements in the United States have been violently repressed, suppressed. During World War I, the leader of the Socialist Party, Victor Eugene Debs, was put in prison because he voiced objections to the United States being in World War I. He was put in prison. He ran for president, actually, while he was in prison. He got a couple million votes. But, my point is that there's good about the history of the United States, but there's a lot that's bad about the history of the United States. And there are a lot of people in the United States who want to deny the bad. And as a political party, this denial is most prevalent, it's strongest in the Republican Party. And in my view, that's a very bad thing. Others? Yes?
In your latest book, you compare affirmative action with the medicine. Does it mean that the USA are ill? Is racism the illness, and is it an illness that can be cured?
Yes, I think it is an illness that can be cured. You're right. At one point in that book, For Discrimination, I say that affirmative action is like any other medicine. It can be toxic if you take too much of it. But like a good medicine, it can be helpful. And on your question of do I think that racism in America can be cured? The answer is yes, I think. Now, in the history of the United States, in talk about racism, there's been a lot of talk about racism. People have written many, many books about racism in America, many, many speeches. You can divide talk about racism in America. You can divide the talk into two big camps. One camp is, I call it the optimistic camp, and one camp is the pessimistic camp. Let me say a few words about the pessimistic camp first, because actually it's the more interesting of the two. The pessimistic camp is the camp that believes that racism in America is incurable, that there will always be racism in America, that there will never be racial equality in America. So someone else earlier mentioned Martin Luther King Jr., the Civil Rights Movement. You're familiar with the song "We Shall Overcome." "We Shall Overcome" was an important song that was sung in demonstrations in the 1950s, well, 1960s. There's some people in America who believe that we shall not overcome, that America is just so thoroughly racist that no matter what, racism will always be an important force in American life. And there are a lot of many important and impressive people who believe that. So for instance, have you all heard of Thomas Jefferson? Thomas Jefferson, the author of the Declaration of Independence, the third president of the United States. Thomas Jefferson believed that racism in the United States was incurable. He thought that blacks and whites would never be able to live together on an equal basis in the United States. Another person who had a very similar belief was Abraham Lincoln. Have you all heard of Abraham Lincoln? Abraham Lincoln was the president of the United States during the Civil War. He was the 16th president of the United States. He too believed that racism was so deep that it was incurable. And in fact, throughout Lincoln's life, he was constantly looking for ways to, he thought that the only way that blacks and whites could figure out a decent future was for black people to leave the United States and maybe go to Africa or Central America. Other people who have had this belief, have you ever heard the name Malcolm X?
Yes.
Okay. Malcolm X was a pessimist. He did not think that blacks and whites would be able to get along in the United States. So there's a long tradition of pessimism with respect to race. That's one tradition. That's not the tradition that I put myself in. I voice another tradition. There's an optimistic tradition. There's a tradition that believes that though racism is deeply embedded in American life, there's a tradition that believes we shall overcome. And in the history of America, there are two people in particular that I think have been especially eloquent in voicing this optimistic tradition. In the 19th century, the great voice of the optimistic tradition was a man by the name of Frederick Douglass. Does that name mean anything to anyone? Frederick Douglass was a slave. He ran away from slavery, and he became an abolitionist. And he believed that racism would be overcome in the United States. And then in the 20th century, the great voice of optimism was Martin Luther King Jr. And in fact, his I Have a Dream speech, August 1963, would be the single best example of his belief. And I would put myself in that tradition. I think, over the past 50 years, remember, I was born in 1954. So in my lifetime, I've come from a point in which, in South Carolina, when I was born, blacks and whites lived in completely different universes. And blacks were repressed. When I was born in 1954, it would have been virtually inconceivable, the idea of a black president of the United States. But, this is 2013, and Barack Obama is a black American and is president of the United States. So the United States has changed a good bit. And I think that with intelligent, persistent, collective action, it can change even more.
I'm sorry, we definitely will not have the time to ask all the questions we prepared, but if we may have the time to ask two more,
Fine.
That would be really nice.
Happy to do it.
That's very nice of you.
Yeah.
Maybe we can take to question 13 and then 14. I don't know who was for question 13.
Yes.
As you know, we are working in class on race relation in the US. Our question is, was Obama's 2008 election the embodiment of the American dream for black American community?
Say that again. Say it again.
Was Obama's 2008 election the embodiment of the American dream for Black American community?
Ah, okay. The election of Barack Obama in 2008 was an extraordinary moment in the history of the United States, for all Americans. I knew people who did not vote for Barack Obama, but who nonetheless cried joyfully when he won, because they recognized that this was an extraordinary moment. And even though they did not vote for him, they were happy that he had won. I think for Black Americans, it was it the fulfillment of the American dream? No, it wasn't the fulfillment of the American dream, because frankly, the United States is still beset. It still suffers from racism in lots of different ways. The place where racism is probably most visible in American life and there's the most problem in American life is in the relationship between Black Americans and the administration of criminal justice, Black Americans and the police. For instance, in the United States, the number of people, the percentage of Black people who are in prison in the United States or in jail, much greater than whites. And part of that has to do, not all, but part of that has to do with an ongoing problem of racism in the United States. There are other ways. I mean, if have any of you gone to the United States? Anybody here been gone? Well, at some point you'll probably go. From some point you'll probably go. When you go to any city in the United States, if you get off at an airport, and let's suppose you get into a taxi cab. You could ask any taxi cab driver in any city in the United States, where is the Black section of town? They could tell you. They could say, well, it's either here or here or here. Because in the United States now, it's still the case that you have, that there's still a lot of racial separation. So the United States still suffers from the effects of past discrimination and racial prejudice today. But nonetheless, the election of a Black American as President of the United States, I think, changed the perspective of many Black Americans. There were many Black Americans who really did not, there were some Black Americans who really did not view, they lived in the United States, they're citizens of the United States, but they did not in a deep way view the United States as their country. And I think that for many Black Americans that changed with the election of Barack Obama. So was it the fulfillment of the American dream? Well, it wasn't the fulfillment of the American dream, but it certainly was an event that made many Black Americans think that at some point they might be able to embrace the American dream. Thank you for your question. One more.
You may have heard about French Justice Minister Christiane Taubira, where she's Black and she was recently the object of various racist attacks, like being compared to a monkey, for example.
So what's your vision of French racism, and do you think that this could happen now in the USA?
Good question. The fact of the matter is, it does happen in the United States. So I just was talking about the election of Barack Obama. From the moment that Barack Obama was elected president of the United States, one feature of American culture is that in cartoons and in demonstrations, Barack Obama and his family, not just Barack Obama, but Barack Obama and his family have been portrayed as monkeys and as apes. The idea of Africans being monkeys and apes has a long history in Western culture. In fact, people have written books about the association of Africans and apes. And so, could this happen in the United States? Answer, yes, it has happened. Not just, by the way, not just graffiti, not just people in demonstrations showing Barack Obama as a monkey. In newspapers, Barack Obama has been portrayed as a monkey, as an ape. So yes, that can happen in the United States. With respect to the Minister of Justice, I had heard that she had been the target of racial insult. And did that surprise me? No, it didn't surprise me. I'm not thoroughly familiar with French culture and French politics, but am I aware of racism in French culture and French politics? Yes. So, for instance, in the past 10 years, I'm very aware of, for instance, the riots a few years ago in Paris. I'm aware of, certain amount of, racial tension, racial discord, racial conflict in France.
Well, thank you very much indeed. And I think we can thank you.